Imagine this. You are a young boy, no more than 12 years old, splashing in the sunlit waters of the Bay of Naples. The sea is warm against your skin, waves sparkling with light. The air filled with laughter as you race your brother to see who can dive the deepest. You are free, you are alive, you are innocent. But then you notice them. 3 massive ships slicing toward your shore, their purple sails embroidered with the golden eagle of Rome. Villagers fall silent. Fathers grip their sons' shoulders, mothers rush to gather the youngest children. Everyone knows what those sails mean. The emperor has sent for more boys. Your father's face drains of all color. You don't yet understand, but he does. You've been watched for weeks. The soldiers have seen you dive, seen how long you can hold your breath, how your body cuts through the water like a fish. What you don't know is that those very talents, the gifts that made you special to your family, are about to be turned into weapons against you. By tomorrow, you will no longer sleep beneath your family's roof. You will be in a marble villa on a distant island, trapped in a world of horror that only one man's power could create. This is the story of what the boys of Rome endured on the private island of Emperor Tiberius, a nightmare hidden beneath the waves of history. When Tiberius Julius Caesar Augustus inherited the throne of the Roman Empire in 14 AD, many believed a new golden age had begun. He was a man seasoned by war, marked by discipline, and known for his intelligence and administrative skill. His early years as emperor were defined by stability, his leadership guided by reason, his policies marked by restraint. To the Senate and the people of Rome, he seemed like a worthy successor to Augustus, capable of preserving the empire's strength without the reckless extravagance of men like Caligula who would later follow. Yet beneath the surface of this seasoned commander lay something darker, a fracture in the human spirit that only absolute power could expose. Rome, still basking in the illusion of prosperity, did not see the shadows forming. But by the 3rd decade of his reign, those shadows would stretch across the Bay of Naples, across Capri's marble palaces, and into the lives of countless children stolen from their homes. Tiberius's descent into secrecy began gradually, cloaked beneath the excuse of ill health and exhaustion from decades of military service. In the year 26 AD, he retreated from Rome entirely, abandoning the capital and its endless political struggles. He chose the island of Capri, a jewel of rock rising from the Tyrrhenian Sea, a place at once magnificent and foreboding. Capri was perfect for what he sought, isolated by cliffs so steep they were nearly impossible to scale, surrounded by turbulent currents that punished even the strongest swimmers, guarded by imperial fleets that permitted no vessel to come or go without approval. Officially, Tiberius withdrew for rest and meditation, for contemplation and distance from the poisonous intrigues of Rome. But in truth, this retreat marked the beginning of one of history's most horrifying systems of exploitation, a carefully engineered kingdom of silence where his darkest appetites could flourish unchallenged. The emperor's villa on Capri was no simple estate. It was a sprawling complex of gardens, chambers, hidden corridors, and above all, pools. Pools carved directly into the living rock, pools connected through underwater channels that allowed swimmers to pass unseen beneath marble walls. These were not designed for recreation in the innocent sense. They were instruments of power, spaces where pleasure and cruelty merged, where engineering genius became corrupted by imperial desire. Some pools were shallow, ideal for small children. Others were deep enough to demand feats of endurance, testing how long lungs could resist collapse. The water itself was controlled, warmed, or cooled to precise temperatures by systems of aqueducts and furnaces, creating environments where boys were forced to adapt or break. Nothing about this design was accidental. Every fresco, every passage, every hidden chamber was calibrated for secrecy, efficiency, and above all, silence. What made Capri a true prison was not its walls, but the complete control exerted by imperial agents who managed the island with ruthless precision. Ships patrolled the coastlines, watchtowers scanned the seas, and guards monitored every approach. Escape was impossible. Parents and families had no hope of reaching the children who vanished, for even whispers of resistance could bring the weight of imperial law crashing down on entire villages. The island became a closed circuit of horror, where those inside learned quickly that the outside world would never intervene. Rome itself turned its face away. Senators might whisper about the emperor's retreat and his eccentricities, but no one dared confront him. His power was absolute, and in that absolute power he created an institution of abuse as organized and efficient as any legion of the Roman army. The boys themselves were chosen with a methodical cruelty that makes the blood run cold even centuries later. Imperial scouts moved quietly along the coasts of Italy and beyond, disguised as administrators or merchants, their true mission hidden beneath polite words and official seals. They watched villages carefully, studying children who spent their days in water, noting which boys could dive longest, which could swim with the grace of dolphins, which had the beauty of youth untouched by labor or hardship. These scouts kept meticulous records, sending reports back to Capri with the names of children who fit the emperor's criteria. Age mattered. Between 8 and 14, young enough to be controlled, old enough to endure training. Appearance mattered. Dark eyes, strong limbs, healthy teeth, symmetrical features. But above all, skill mattered. The ability to hold breath underwater, to glide silently beneath the surface, to move as if born of the sea. It was a fisherman's talent, transformed into a death sentence. When the imperial ships arrived, they did not come with explanation or negotiation. They came with authority. Soldiers carried documents declaring the emperor's will, and in Rome, the emperor's will was law. Parents were told their children were being chosen for service, sometimes promised that their families would benefit, sometimes threatened into silence. A few were given coins, payment so small it mocked their grief. Others resisted and paid with their lives, cut down in front of their sons as warnings to the rest. And so, boys were torn from their homes, from their villages, from the embrace of families who would never see them again. The sea that had once been their playground became their captor, carrying them away to Capri's cliffs where innocence ended. For the boys who arrived, Capri at first seemed a place of beauty. The villas gleamed white against the emerald hills, the sea sparkled in every direction, gardens bloomed with fruit and flowers. Yet within hours, the illusion dissolved. Examinations awaited them, physicians and overseers testing each child as though he were livestock. Teeth were checked, limbs bent, chests measured, and most importantly, lungs were tested. Boys were forced into the pools immediately, commanded to dive for coins, to swim passages, to hold breath while guards timed them with cold efficiency. Those who failed disappeared, their cries swallowed by the island's silence. Those who passed were given new tunics, beds in marble chambers, and a place in the emperor's collection. Thus began the transformation of Capri, from island paradise to nightmare prison. The laughter of childhood was replaced by whispered rules of survival, passed from one boy to the next in the dormitories where frescoes of ocean gods mocked their captivity. Every step of their new existence was dictated by fear, fear of failing, fear of being noticed, fear of being forgotten. And behind it all loomed the shadow of Tiberius himself, the emperor who turned the sea into his hunting ground, who transformed children into little fishes, trained to swim not for joy but for his private indulgence. Capri was no retreat. It was a machine, a system of abuse so carefully built that it functioned with the efficiency of empire. And once you entered, there was no way back. Your first night on the island did not begin with sleep, but with a lesson in how silence replaces language when fear becomes the only grammar a child understands. Because as the lamps guttered along the corridor and the guard's sandals scraped and faded, the dormitory filled with the soft rustle of whispered instructions from boys who had already traded seasons of their lives to this place, and they told you without drama or comfort that questions would buy you punishment, that tears would buy you nothing at all, and that listening, real listening that turns the bones cold, might keep you alive long enough to learn the rules that were never posted on any wall. Rules that moved like water and changed like weather. Rules that said you do not speak unless addressed, you never make your eyes meet the ruler's gaze. You obey as if disobedience were a cliff edge beneath your feet. And you practice swimming until your lungs ache, because here your breath is the only currency you possess. Morning arrived without dawn because marble admits light the way a cage admits freedom, only as a reminder of what you no longer own, and before food or prayer or any ritual that might have belonged to a normal childhood, you were led to the pools that had been carved. Not for play but for control, basins of stone linked by passages that swallowed sound and exhaled steam, channels that allowed bodies to move unseen beneath the water, like creatures in a dream that no divine mercy would end. And the overseers who stood with tablets and styluses did not look like barbarians out of campfire tales, but like bookkeepers of flesh, measuring chests and timing dives, noting how long a boy could vanish beneath the surface. Training did not begin with shouting or whips, because those are crude tools, and this place preferred instruments that could shape the soul without leaving marks a senator might see. And so you were assigned an older boy whose face still held the geography of youth, but whose eyes carried the weariness of men twice his age, and he taught you in a voice that tried not to break how to move through water without a ripple, how to draw breath as if drawing it were a privilege granted by a temper you could never predict, how to feel the shape of a room with your skin and to count heartbeats when time itself began to coil. The day's instruction spilled into evening until the line between work and waiting disappeared, and in the spaces between sessions you learned the social topography of captivity, the newcomers who watched everything with a stunned, raw stare, the careful survivors who bartered knowledge for scraps of safety, the broken ones whose spirits had retreated somewhere far inland where waves could not follow, the handful who had mastered the art of becoming invisible while never being absent. And within this grim republic of children, the currency was not age or beauty alone, but the ability to anticipate weather inside another human being, because if you read the winds wrong, you were dragged into punishments that were designed not simply to hurt, but to... The pools remained the center of everything, not because water purifies, but because water conceals, and you grew intimate with its moods. The shallow basins where boys stood arranged like chess pieces while attendants dictated patterns, the black-mouthed tunnels where you learned to navigate by touch and faith, the deeper tanks where you practiced disappearing and reappearing as if your body were a trick the sea performed on command. And sometimes, when you floated on your back during a rare moment of reprieve and stared up at frescoes of Nereids and dolphins, you realized with a clarity too sharp for your years that the beauty here was not decoration but anesthesia. Education arrived dressed as benevolence, which made it crueler, because tutors came with scrolls and recitations, with lines of Virgil and the geometry of arches, with lessons in penmanship and accounts. And you saw that a day could contain both a passage from history about honor and a command that stripped a child of it. And sometimes the emperor himself appeared as a lecturer, a man whose voice could be patient and cultivated, discussing the lineage of wars or the movement of the stars with a seriousness that made you feel for one treacherous heartbeat that you were once again a boy in a world that could be understood. Yet the room always remembered before you did, because the air carried an undertow of dread and the attendant's eye hierarchy hardened as weeks turned into months, and it settled around you like sediment, with scribes who recorded your times and tolerances and temperaments as though you were inventory rather than human, with attendants who spoke of schedules as if cruelty were simply logistics, with stewards who rewarded a boy for performing exactly as instructed and punished another for hesitating by one heartbeat. And in that climate you began to understand why some children clung to tiny privileges as if to driftwood, why they competed to predict a command before it was voiced, why they learned to smile at favors that made them want to vanish. Because when every door leads to a chamber designed by someone else's if there was mercy, it came rarely and never from above. It came in the way a mentor adjusted a practice to spare your lungs without alerting the overseer, in the way bread was shared among the younger boys when the ration seemed deliberately thin, in the way a soft joke survived at the edge of a night when laughter felt like blasphemy. And yet every kindness existed inside a machine that did not slow for it, because the schedule resumed at first light and the water waited with the same blank patience. And you discovered that the most dangerous transformation was not the bruises that faded or the muscles that strengthened, but the slow rearrangement of thought that taught you to measure yourself by how useful you had become to the very So the days gathered around you like stones, each one heavy and similarly shaped. And though the island still shimmered for visitors who came to admire terraces and views, you knew that the truest design was hidden beneath the waterline where corridors stitched pools into a labyrinth, and where children learned to move as shadows move, and the first season ended with a knowledge nobody could take from you and nobody would envy. That Capri was not a retreat but a refinery, a place where innocence was boiled down until only obedience remained, and that survival here would require a vigilance so complete it would cost you the very ease that makes a child. Which is to say you had entered the second life of you by the time your first months bled into seasons. You had learned the routine so thoroughly that your body seemed to move through its stages without the participation of your mind. And yet, no matter how carefully you followed every rule, no matter how deeply you buried your own thoughts beneath obedience, there came the moment that every boy dreaded, the summons to serve personally. And that moment did not arrive with warning or ceremony, but with a sudden gesture from a guard, a curt nod from a steward, a quiet command in the corridor that stripped your stomach of air. And suddenly you found yourself standing at the edge of the main pool, while the Emperor himself reclined upon marble platforms cushioned with silks, his aging body swollen with years, his eyes gleaming with a kind of hunger that was not about food, not about drink, but about something no child should have been forced to learn. He did not roar like a monster out of myth, because monstrosity in its truest form rarely announces itself with the noise of beasts, and instead he spoke softly, even tenderly, in a voice that might have belonged to a grandfather or a patient tutor, instructing his little fishes in what he expected as though he were teaching poetry or mathematics, and you were ordered to swim in patterns around him, to dive beneath the water and rise again in rhythm, to circle his form with motions that turned your body into both ornament and instrument. And though your heart pounded as if it wished to escape your chest, you followed. Because to falter was to risk punishment, and to displease him was to vanish. The softness of his tone only deepened the terror, for cruelty disguised in gentleness makes a prison feel eternal, and every stroke through the water stole a fragment of who you had once been. The manipulation was not only physical but psychological, calculated with the precision of a strategist who knew that fear alone could break bodies, but that despair could break souls. Boys who performed well, who swam silently and obeyed quickly, received scraps of praise, a nod of approval, perhaps better food or warmer clothes. And in the barren economy of Capri, such gestures became more intoxicating than gold, because when your days were measured by hunger and your nights by dread, even the illusion of favor felt like salvation. Yet it was poison, for it taught you to equate degradation with reward, obedience with life itself, until survival no longer meant preserving who you were, but abandoning who you had been. Those who faltered learned swiftly that disobedience or hesitation drew punishments not merely of the flesh but of the mind. Cold isolation in subterranean chambers where dripping water marked hours with the cruelty of eternity, or reductions in rations that taught the body to crave bread as though it were divine, and each punishment reinforced the terrible logic of the place. Gratitude must attach itself to horror, and acceptance must replace resistance. You watched the transformation play out across the faces of those around you, each boy representing a stage in the destruction of innocence. The newcomers, still trembling with shock, whispered questions at night until silence became their language. The veterans, like Marcus, who had learned to predict imperial moods, moved through the routines with grim efficiency, saving fragments of themselves by surrendering others. And then there were the broken ones, hollow shells who drifted through the chambers with eyes that seemed to see only the horizon of another world, children whose laughter had been stolen so completely that their presence was a warning in itself. Among them was Lucius, who had survived 4 years when you arrived, though survival was not the right word for the way he existed, moving mechanically, refusing food until one day his body gave out, his death interpreted not as tragedy but as a choice, the only door left open when every other exit had been bricked shut by the Emperor's appetite. His passing was whispered among the boys not as defeat but as escape, and that whisper haunted you more than any punishment because it planted the thought that survival might be its own kind of death. The villa itself encouraged this descent into unreality because beauty served as mask, and the frescoes of sea gods, the mosaics of dolphins, the carefully engineered pools that glistened like jewels, all of it was designed to remind you of what had once been joy, twisting memory into mockery. Education continued in parallel. Lessons in reading and history delivered in the same halls where silence was enforced by fear, and sometimes Tiberius himself would lecture on literature or law, his intelligence undeniable, his sophistication genuine, and that was perhaps the cruelest part, for it taught you that evil is not always stupidity or barbarism, but brilliance turned inward, reason wielded as a scalpel, refinement harnessed in service of rot. How could a man so capable of discussing the stars or the battles of Rome also transform children into tools of his appetites? The contradiction was the abyss itself, and staring into it changed you. Over time, you realized that Capri had become a machine, not a collection of random cruelties, but a systematic program of transformation that operated with the same precision as any imperial bureaucracy. Records were kept of your progress: how long you could hold your breath, how many patterns you could swim, what skills you could demonstrate. Written into scrolls by scribes who themselves had once been boys in your place and who now perpetuated the same cycle that had broken them. The very act of documenting your degradation turned you into inventory, reducing your existence to numbers and notes, stripping you of even the dignity of being nameless. You were livestock, measured and catalogued, awaiting a fate that could come at any hour, and the realization hollowed you out from within. As months dissolved into years, you understood the rhythms of horror that governed the island, the seasonal changes that dictated how many boys arrived, how many vanished, how intense the demands became. Summers were busiest, seas calm enough for imperial ships to ferry in new victims, filling dormitories faster than beds could cool. Winters were slower but darker, with longer sessions in heated pools, demands intensified as the emperor spent more hours cloistered indoors, his declining health sharpening his cravings into obsessions. Your survival became a balancing act, navigating between compliance and the preservation of some fragile fragment of self, reading his moods as though they were weather patterns, bending yourself into shapes demanded by the tides of his appetites, while secretly wondering if there remained any part of you unbent. By your third year, the truth had become undeniable. Capri was not merely an island, not even a villa, but a world unto itself, a prison without walls, a laboratory of cruelty where children were both subjects and experiments, and in that world the boy who had once swum for seashells in Naples no longer existed. What remained was a creature of water and silence, trained to anticipate commands before they were voiced, to measure days by the emperor's moods, to live in the shadow of a man who had turned innocence into spectacle. And you began to ask yourself in the privacy of thought you dared not share aloud whether survival meant preserving your life or abandoning it entirely, whether the cost of breathing in Capri was greater than the cost of never breathing again. As the years uncoiled on Capri, the rhythm of captivity settled into a pattern that was both predictable and suffocating. But with each cycle you began to notice changes not in the system itself, which ran like a machine designed to grind children into silence, but in the man at its center. For Tiberius was no longer the vigorous commander who had once led legions across Europe, nor even the calculating politician who had governed Rome from afar, but an old man whose body betrayed him with every passing season. A body plagued by skin conditions that made contact painful, by lungs that wheezed with effort in the heated pools, by a stomach that no longer digested with ease. Yet rather than softening his demands or withdrawing into the gentleness that age sometimes brings, his decline seemed to intensify his appetites, to twist them further, to drive him to wring out of the boys around him whatever vitality he could no longer generate for himself. And so the empire of silence on Capri did not weaken with the emperor's failing flesh, but grew more desperate, more cruel, more consuming. The sessions in the pools lengthened into ordeals that bent even the strongest boys toward collapse, because what had once been a demonstration of grace and endurance became a grotesque competition against the emperor's failing body, where children were expected to compensate for his decline, to invent new ways to satisfy his cravings, to stretch their own strength into shapes that human beings were never meant to hold. And when his age robbed him of pleasures once easily taken, he demanded longer performances, greater extremes, punishing the boys with expectations that ignored the limits of flesh. And so exhaustion became the constant companion of every survivor. The weight that clung to their Marcus, the boy who had been your guide and protector, embodied the paradox of survival on Capri, for he had outlasted nearly everyone else by becoming adept at reading moods before they turned into commands, by predicting shifts in the emperor's desires before they surfaced, by sacrificing fragments of himself so carefully that he seemed almost untouchable. And yet even Marcus, who had endured 5 years of this unnatural existence, began to fray at the edges, his eyes dark with sleeplessness, his voice lower, his silences longer, until one spring morning, after an ordeal that lasted nearly a whole day and involved more boys than you had ever seen summoned at once, Marcus returned to the dormitory with a gaze. His disappearance shattered whatever fragile illusions remained, that endurance itself was victory, because the truth descended on you like a tide that could not be resisted. The boy who had once been a teacher, who had whispered instructions with a gentleness that defied the cruelty of the island, had chosen death as the only doorway left open. And his choice made clear that the true purpose of Capri was not merely to use boys, but to consume them until nothing recognizable remained. And whether that end came in the pools, in the chambers of isolation, or in the silent leap from the cliffs, the result was the same. You understood then that the marble villa was not simply a palace of indulgence, but a machine of annihilation, designed with such precision that even those who survived carried scars too deep to be healed, their identities dissolved into roles imposed by a single man's hunger. The emperor himself seemed to take no notice of the boys who vanished, or perhaps he did and chose silence, because his mind had long since rearranged itself to treat children as tools rather than as beings with histories and families. And so while you mourned Marcus in stolen moments and whispered prayers, the system continued uninterrupted. The stewards still recorded times and performances. The tutors still recorded times and performances. The tutors still recited Virgil as though literature could coexist with torment, and the pools still steamed at dawn as if nothing had changed. And in that unbroken continuity, you felt the most terrifying truth of all. By your third year, you recognized that the villa had created its own society, a twisted ecosystem where the boys themselves developed hierarchies of compliance and adaptation, where some sought favor with the overseers in exchange for scraps of food or warmth, where others retreated into silence so deep it seemed to erase them, where newcomers were initiated into terror with whispers passed down like sacred texts, and where the broken ones became living reminders that the human spirit could not survive unbent under endless weight. Capri had become not just an island, but a world, self-contained, self-sustaining, and utterly sealed from the outside. And in that world the line between victim and participant blurred, because survival sometimes required actions that betrayed others, and betrayal sometimes seemed like the only way to breathe one more day. And so the island did not merely wound bodies but corrupted souls, weaving guilt and fear into every breath. The emperor's decline only deepened this corruption, because as his body weakened his paranoia sharpened, and rumors spread among the boys that he kept ever more detailed records, documenting not only performance but moods, punishments, disappearances, as though compiling an archive of his own cruelty. And some whispered that these records were kept by scribes who themselves had once been little fishes, boys who had outlasted the pools only to become functionaries of the system, perpetuating the same horrors on the next generation. And when you imagined such a fate, you felt the ground tilt beneath you, because survival no longer seemed like salvation if it meant becoming the hand that turned the gears. It was in those moments, as you watched Marcus's empty bed and Lucius's vanished body haunt the dormitory, that you realized the cost of Capri was not measured only in the lives extinguished, but in the transformation of those left behind. For the boy who once swam for shells and laughed in sunlight was already gone, replaced by a creature of silence and calculation, a being who counted breaths like coins and weighed every glance for danger. And though your body still lived, the question gnawed at you like a parasite. When the end finally came, it did not arrive as liberation, but as another shift in the atmosphere of the island. Subtle at first, whispered among guards and stewards who spoke in low tones about the emperor's declining pulse, the heaviness of his breathing, the days he no longer descended to the pools. And though you might have expected relief, what you felt instead was dread. For the machine of Capri did not stop simply because its master weakened, and the boys still trained. The overseers still measured, the scribes still recorded, as though the system had grown so large and self-sustaining that it no longer required the presence of the man who had birthed it. Tiberius lingered in his 70s, his body collapsing beneath disease and exhaustion, his flesh pale and mottled, his eyes sunken but still sharp when they opened. And in those final months he seemed less a ruler than a phantom, drifting through the corridors like a spirit unwilling to release its grasp, demanding attendance even when his voice had faded to whispers, ensuring that his appetite, though diminished, still held sway over every child trapped within the marble walls. The day of his death in 37 AD was marked not by trumpet or proclamation, but by a silence so dense it seemed the island itself was holding its breath, and the story spread later that it may not have been natural at all, that the commander of his Praetorian Guard, weary of his cruelty and fearful of what might follow, hastened to the end with his own hands, smothering the failing emperor to ensure a transition. But whether his death was plotted or ordained by age, the result for the boys of Capri was the same. The figure whose shadow had defined every heartbeat of their childhood was gone, and in his absence there was no sudden unlocking of chains, no flight back to waiting families. Instead, the island remained sealed, its secrets too poisonous to be revealed, its survivors too dangerous to be returned unmonitored into the world. Guards continued their patrols, attendants continued their work, and you discovered that the machine could outlive the man who had designed it, because silence was now its own commander and shame its own general. The fate of those who had endured alongside you was scattered like ashes in the wind, each story vanishing into the gaps of history. Some boys were quietly transferred to other estates of the empire, their skills redirected toward services that bore different names but carried the same weight of exploitation, while others disappeared altogether, removed so that their memories could not disturb the carefully curated image of Rome's greatness. A few attempted to return to their families, but by the time they reached the doorways of homes they had once known, their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, their laughter extinguished, and parents who had imagined children lost to the sea found strangers instead, beings carved into shapes unrecognizable by love, and the reunion became another wound rather than healing. For most, there was no return at all, for the empire understood that witnesses could be dangerous, that the testimony of children would stain the legacy of power, and so their names were erased, their bodies dispersed, their fates left unrecorded, as though they had never existed. The villa itself, that palace of polished cruelty, was sealed shortly after Tiberius's death, its chambers closed, its pools drained, its frescoes left to fade beneath salt air and neglect. Future generations would walk its corridors and marvel at the engineering, admire the mosaics, speak of imperial luxury. But few would whisper the truth of what had occurred there, because history, written by senators and scholars who understood the cost of scandal, chose to reduce the horror to euphemism, recording in careful Latin phrases that the emperor had indulged in excesses, that he had gathered companions, that he had withdrawn into eccentricity, while the screams of boys were buried under the weight of marble and silence. Yet fragments of truth survived in the writings of Suetonius and others, who, decades later, still heard echoes of what had been whispered, and their accounts, though veiled, left little doubt of the systematic cruelty that had turned Capri into a shrine of suffering, a place where childhood was sacrificed upon the altar of imperial appetite. You, if you were among the few who lived beyond that island, carried not the pride of survival, but the burden of memory, because the body may heal, but the mind does not forget corridors lined with torches that lit the path to pools where breath was stolen for someone else's pleasure. Nor does the heart forget the absence of boys who had lain beside you one evening and were gone the next, their beds cold, their names erased. What remained was not triumph but haunting, the knowledge that the world beyond Capri would never understand the weight of silence you bore, the awareness that Rome itself preferred not to see, because its empire rested on discipline, on obedience, on the unbroken image of power, and acknowledging what had been done on Capri would crack that image beyond repair. And so, you carried it alone, like a scar invisible to all but those who had lived in the shadow of purple sails. The horrific abuse boys endured on that Roman emperor's private island was not a tragedy confined to one generation, nor to one set of cliffs above the Tyrrhenian Sea. It was a demonstration of what absolute power can birth when it abandons restraint, of how genius can twist into perversion when accountability is stripped away, of how entire systems can collaborate to protect cruelty under the guise of duty, and of how innocence, once stolen, cannot be returned. Capri became a symbol not only of one man's appetite, but of an empire's willingness to look away, a testament to the darkest truth of history, that beneath the marble, beneath the frescoes, beneath the speeches about law and glory, there are always shadows where human lives are consumed, and the silence of those shadows is as damning as any inscription carved in stone. And now, centuries later, as we stand among the ruins and peer into pools that once shimmered with sunlight but were filled with screams, we must remember not only the emperor whose name still echoes in textbooks, but the countless children whose names were never written down, who lived and died as inventory in an empire of cruelty, and who deserve to be remembered not as shadows, but as voices, however faint, carried forward by history's conscience. Their suffering is the real legacy of Capri, their absence the true monument, and their story a warning written not in marble, but in silence that still lingers across the waves. If you found this story haunting, if you believe history's darkest corners must be remembered and not buried, then I invite you to support this work. Like this video so others may discover it, subscribe for more truths pulled from the shadows of the past, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because each time we speak their names, we deny the silence that once swallowed them whole.